All right, welcome everyone. Going to give it a couple of seconds while we let audio connect here and get folks in. I think we're looking good. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for a virtual event with Daphne Merkin and David Shields. A few quick Zoom housekeeping details before we get started. You are muted. You will remain muted throughout the duration of this event. For optimal viewing, use your Zoom view functions to select speaker view so that our author is highlighted on your screen. Please ask questions in the chat box function. We will get to as many of your questions as possible. We are behind the scenes monitoring the chat box, so send your questions along. And if at any time you drop off the Zoom or experience a technical difficulty, simply click the link again and we will readmit you. Finally, and most importantly, please do not forget to purchase a copy of 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love at rjjulia.com or bookhampton.com. You can click on the link in the chat box for quick and easy purchase. And on behalf of RJ Julia, Wesley and RJ Julia, and BookHampton, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'll pass it off to owner of RJ Julia, Roxanne Cody, to introduce tonight's featured guests. So please give a warm digital virtual welcome first to Roxanne Cody.
Thanks, Erica. Hi to everybody. Welcome on behalf, as Erica said, RJ Julia's in Madison, Wesley and RJ Julia, and BookHampton out in East Hampton. I am delighted to welcome this afternoon or early evening one of the most gifted, bold, expansive writers, Daphne Merkin. Whether it's her novel Enchantment, which is newly available in a reprint, and it's a fascinating novel about what families do when they're not being observed, something most of us wouldn't want to have happen to our families, or her provocative, delicious essays in Dreaming of Hitler and Fame Lunches, and probably in every magazine that's on the planet that she's written in, or her memoir about her journey with depression, This Close to Happy. You can count on a couple of things: exquisite writing, fresh points of view on the mundane to the marvelous, and often with a underlying sexual tension, and always, always expressing her wish to expose complexities ignored by absolutists on both ends of the spectrum or all stripes. And she does all this again with her new novel, 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love. She's only been working on this 30 years, but she finally got it done. And in this book, she not only redefines the structure of the novel, but she also explores sexual obsession. And while listening to her would be satisfying enough, the bonus is she will be in conversation with David Shields, another prolific writer who has 22 books, numerous awards. He's an NEA fellow, a Guggenheim fellow, and a man described as a writing revolutionary. And his best-selling book, Reality Hunger, which I also would encourage you to buy if you haven't read it, challenges the construct of fiction and nonfiction. So who better to engage in a conversation with Daphne Merkin? So on behalf of all of the stores and all of you, welcome David Shields and Daphne Merkin.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Hi, Daphne. It's great to talk. Yes. We've been email friends and acquaintances and correspondents
for a while.
For many years. It's great to actually engage with you. As you know, I'm a longtime fan of your work, from Enchantment to essays to this new novel. Could talk to you for a very long time about all the issues that your work raises, but obviously the focus tonight is on the new book, 22 Minutes. I guess I'll start, Daphne, with, and obviously, please guide the conversation in whatever direction you want. But, you know, the sort of peekaboo structure of the book interests me a lot, where there's kind of an author, there's a narrator, there's a speaker, there's an implied kind of Daphne Merkin character off the page. There's these sort of peekaboo conversations with the reader, you know, where am I, dear reader? And I think, you know, I read the book initially a few months ago, and then I reread it recently. And I think what strikes me about the sort of mirrors upon mirrors structure of the book is that it doesn't create a pale fire like feeling of artifice upon artifice. Instead, it feels like that we're getting closer and closer to, it's almost like the peekaboo structure is a way for the writer or the author, the speaker to flirt with getting closer and closer to her own confessionality. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, if you even agree with what I'm saying, and the way that might be related to the many versions of the book that this novel went through. That is to say, there's a sense in which the kind of many versions that the book went through get mirrored in this multi-layered structure. So I have a lot of questions built in there. I don't know if you can play with some of the half-baked notions I'm conveying to you.
First of all, they don't seem half-baked. They seem very thoughtful, and a lot of the questions go to the heart, I think, both of what I was trying to do with the novel and why I had this 30-year struggle with the novel. I debated back and forth whether I would use what I call digressions. Because in some sense, if the novel had been written without them, it would be a different kind of read. It would be I still hope it is a propulsive, for lack of a better word, read that pulls you in. But if I hadn't used them, it would have been a sort of, you know, a novel about a obsessional, somewhat S&M-y relationship, and it would come to an end. One of the things when I first described what I wanted to do 30 years ago to two editors at a press that no longer exists called Poseidon, I don't know if you remember it, they published
Sure, yeah, I remember it.
Yeah. I said I was very interested in obsession and also how you get out of obsession, that the only way out of it can't just be Anna Karenina throwing herself under a train, or let's say 9.5 weeks. I think she's carted off. She sort of goes crazy. And other books I've read on the subject of obsession usually end with some sort of profound, not destruction of the character who's obsessed, but fragmentation. The character, I'm thinking of a female character, but there's also Endless Love by Scott Spencer, certainly about an obsession. I wanted to see if I could get the female character out of the obsession, especially since it wasn't, quote, good for her, ultimately. And how would I do that? And I partly had trouble figuring out what would be the most persuasive way. I sort of thought, she'll kill him, she'll, again, jump off a roof, she'll go to a mental hospital, all these kind of things. And I thought, why can't it be an exertion of will, which exists, and that, but for better and worse in some people, and that you decide somehow that you're losing something by giving up on the a relationship, the passion, but you're also gaining a degree of sanity. And I think what I wanted with I was going to say discursions, that's not what they're called. The things that, that go off. Digressions. First, I always had them. I had them many, many years ago, partly, I think, because I was a conscientious graduate student at Columbia, and it was the height of deconstructionism. And I remembered the phrase, or I'll take credit for making it up, but I think I remember it, called perforating the text. And I loved the idea of entering a story and sort of just, is it the fourth wall, and breaking the fourth wall, and sort of pulling back from, this is a master narrative. You are the dutiful reader following along with what the author, in my case, I am doing. And I somewhat wanted to bring in the reader, not so differently from some of your interests. And it was all before the term metafiction existed, a term which I always think is not necessary, but that's me. I wanted to bring together autobiographical, not autobiographical, thus the whole issue of first person, second person, third person. Originally, the whole book was written in third person, but that left out musings. I have an essayistic voice that I wanted to use to comment on some of what was going on. And then lastly, for some people who are younger, which is probably everyone listening to this, I had been very friendly with Diana Trilling, Lionel Trilling's wife, and I somehow wanted the novel to appeal to my sister-in-law in New Jersey and Diana Trilling, meaning someone who reads with a greater degree of self-consciousness as a reader, and then the more average reader who reads either for the story or to identify. Although when I teach reading or writing, I always say the lowest level of reading is identification. I mean, it's not going to open up a new world for you if you simply read a book to say, oh, that's how I feel. So I don't know if that was a long-winded and wayward response to what you were asking, but.
No, it was that was, there's no one answer.
Right.
But I think one thing that you did an event, I guess, at McNally, and I was part of the audience for that a month or two ago. And I forgot if I asked you a question or someone had asked you a question. I think it was an online question. I don't know if you even saw it. It was rather a rude question, but I thought it was an interesting question in which the person had written something like, what distinguishes this book, 22 Minutes, from, say, 50 Shades of Grey? And I think it's an interesting question in the sense that great novels, Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, Wuthering Heights, those are just soap operas, but they are raised to the level of immemorial art by the level of sophistication that the writer brings to their material. So I thought it was sort of a silly question and rather a rude question, and maybe trying to get a rise out of you. I don't know if you even saw it as an online question, but in a way it raises an interesting question that by perforating the text as you do, you're trying, in my view, to try and raise all these complicated questions and basically try to implicate both yourself as writer and the reader as voyeur. And I'm just hoping you could address that whole idea of, yes, of course, most great novels reduced to their bare narrative bones are soap operas. And I think, I don't know, I just wanted you to play with that idea if you saw that question and how perforating the text try to take us out of a 50 Shades sort of heavy panting, fire breathing narrative.
Right. I think I did see the question. I think I even answered it with some probably unfiltered disdain.
Right.
Only because I was sent, given some of what I've written about over my life, over time, I think I was sent 6 galleys
Of 50 Shades.
50 Shades of Grey.
That's hilarious.
And I started reading it, and I will admit, I wasn't bored to death, but I stopped on page 60 because it seemed to me almost a novel as much about consumerism. Everything is named, is plain, the clothes.
Right.
As it is about sex. I also did not find the whole setup really persuasive. I thought it was, they used to use the word vanilla. I think it's gone out of usage. I thought it was a very vanilla, unpsychologically informed way of getting to a subject that supposedly is taboo. I mean, quite a number of years ago, I wrote a piece for the New York Times Magazine called The Last Taboo, of which there are many in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But I interviewed a lot of women, and they all said, what they really wanted was the man to take over and assert dominance, control. So I think she was speaking to not an unconscious or conscious wish that is very unfashionable now. And she got in on that. I just didn't find, for my liking, I mean, in answer to whoever asked, how's it different from 50 Shades of Grey? One could answer there are only a certain number of plots in the world. To me, writing stands and falls on style. That's me. I think the plot, even though I kept telling myself, put in plot, she works in book publishing, she has a gay friend she takes to a Shabbos dinner, all these scenes to sort of expand the arena. But I guess I didn't find 50 Shades of Grey interesting. It seemed, I know this sounds terrible, like Hillary Clinton talking about the basket of deplorables, which I don't mean, but I kept thinking it was for sort of slightly repressed housewives in the Midwest who thought this was shocking. Since I didn't find it remotely shocking, and on the level of psychological awareness, I thought it came up short. So I didn't see much parallel.
Right. No, I just wanted to hear you play with those ideas a little bit. That's really, you and I share an admiration of the psychoanalyst Robert Stoller, who explores these issues really well. Yeah. And you, in your recent Washington Post essay about the book, is an excellent essay that I recommend everybody read, that you name check Stoller. And there's a book of his that I haven't read yet called Sexual Excitement, which I'm currently reading and absolutely loving. It's an incredible book. But I do know a lot of earlier stuff of Stoller's as well. And I think one thing about that Stoller does in a lot of his work is that he sort of, especially in this book, Sexual Excitement, which was published in '79. So my goodness, it's 40 years old. But you know, it's sort of, he often uses case studies in his work, you know, as does Freud, as do a lot of writers who are psychoanalysts. But I feel like what among the many interesting things about 22 Minutes for me is that, you know, in no way is the work a case study, but I think the two main characters, the man and the woman, to me are not, in my reading of it, and maybe I'm misreading, and you may not even be crazy about this idea, but to me the characters are not meant to be wildly fully developed characters. To me, they're meant to be sort of holding tanks in which the reader can pour themselves, so that, I don't know if you can think about that idea a bit. What is her name? Judith Rose? Is she the main?
Judith
I'm
Stone.
always, sorry?
No, I think she's Judith Stone and he's
Judith,
Howard Rose.
I would say even those names are meant to be a little generic,
Yes.
and I think to me it's really fascinating and powerfully provocative and even sort of sexy that the characters are almost there. He very much is he's, the famously withholding Svengali a bit, who shows a dollop of affection. For every dollop of affection, he offers 5 strokes of punishment. And she is, drawn toward his sexual allure, which is dependent on his cruelty and occasional dollops of affection. In any case, what's so fascinating is, I was wondering if you agree with me, and if you could talk about that a bit, how the characters are, to me, not, hugely fleshed out. They're meant to be a little bit of types. If you agree with that, and if so, is there a way in which I do think that pushes the book toward allegory, toward sort of psychological case study, and I think it forces the reader, it forced me to ask, okay, where do you fall on this paradigm? To what degree do you agree with this as a sexual barometer? So I was wondering if you could talk about character and depth and the way that forces the reader to ask themselves interesting questions.
First of all, you are the only person I know, including psychoanalysts, who heard of Robert Stoller. So it interested me that you did. I had read he's a psychoanalyst.
I mean, I'm obsessed with Stoller. I mean, yeah.
He wrote me a letter about my first novel in Chapman.
Wow.
And I once considered going out to California just sort of to visit him or consult with him. I was always consulting. But you know how he died. He backed
a car accident, wasn't it? And he
out of his
relatively
driveway.
young. I think he was around 65 or so.
Yeah. I think you're right that I didn't want to make the characters, in a way, I didn't want them to be generic, which would be boring, I think. But I didn't want them to be so specific that you couldn't push yourself into some of the space that was left around them. Also, I guess, in all truth, I didn't want to totally repeat my own character that has been on display in essays. Enchantment was much more directly about me and my upbringing. I wanted to, and I mean, I think in this way you're very right. I wanted to make them specific enough that they didn't seem cardboard.
Right.
But not with like grave, weird tics that you couldn't, you would read it and say, but I would never jump off a trampoline. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
They stayed within a certain realm. If I would say anything candidly about the novel, I would say Judith Stone and the Stone Rose thing was very chosen, since he does open her up, to give him that credit. I think the man, Howard, is probably less developed than the woman, Judith.
Right.
And I did consider, in my many, many considerations, writing the story from his side.
Wow.
Like, maybe would have been a better book, like one chapter her, then how did he see it? a lot of which has been used for TV now.
Right.
But I did mean them to be, if not archetypes, sort of prototypes, maybe more,
A good word, yeah.
of what kind of woman would go for this, have the deprivations or the holes. An editor long ago named Ted Solitaroff, he's not so
Sure,
long
I'm
ago.
friends with Ted. Yeah, I was friends with Ted and his son Paul, yeah.
I once sent him a story in which he said the pegs in the man fit the holes in the woman. And that's sort of what I meant. I mean, I just discussed it with someone who's doing a piece about me in the book and what I think of sadomasochism. I recently watched Sally Rooney, Normal People, and I read both her books. And I think the usage there, however light a basis, that the character, what's her name, Marianne? Something
I don't
like
know, I haven't read it. I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
sort of pushes aside the nicer boyfriend for this jerk who likes to cause her pain. But it's never explained. I mean, she comes from a sort of loveless background. She has a brother who abuses her physically, but it's never linked that somehow that would lead to a certain kind of choice. And I think it's never linked because a lot of these novels, including 50 Shades of Grey, have become much less psychological. They're more, accounts on the surface without delving into the whys and wherefores.
I think that's, yeah. I think one thing about the ending, one thing that I always forget your famous and great essay on spanking. What is its title again, Daphne?
Unlikely Obsession.
Unlikely upset. And that, there's an incredible moment toward the end of the essay in which you find your exit out of this relationship where I think I'm recalling this right, in which the man is insisting that he is dominant even outside of the bedroom. And at that point, you kind of throw up your hands and walk away. Is that a fair paraphrase, that he's saying, hey, I'm the dom in this relationship. I'll tell us what we're going to have to eat, etc. And at that point, you're sort of disgusted or repelled both by him and yourself, and you find an exit ramp out of the relationship. I think I'm recalling that about right. It seems like something slightly similar happens in this book in 22 Minutes, when the female character goes on a vacation with the guy and she finds him, off-putting, that, maybe it's sexy in bed when he's domineering, but that outside of that, it gets very exhausting and, just boring. But I guess the point I'm trying to get to is, if you see that parallel between the exit ramp at the end of Unlikely Obsession and the exit ramp at the end of this book. And also, I always think that the ending of the book is meant to be a bit of a false solution. That is to say, I think that we as readers feel in no way has she found domestic bliss. It's a very tentatively held domestic contentment. And so anyway, I'm just sort of playing those two ideas, that I think I would like the book less well if I felt at the ending of the book of 22 Minutes that she really had resolved these issues and was happily domesticated. To me, it almost feels like a sort of horror story in which the monster of desire and submission is waiting there underneath the living room rug, as it were.
No, that's an interesting way of putting it. To be honest, I do not remember that clearly although the piece haunts me, the piece about spanking, and I think it ends, if I recall, it ends differently, where the man, or you know what, I'm not sure how it ended.
Well, I mean, I thought sure there was a moment. It could be, it's from, you know, to me, Enchantment, your essay on losing your scarf, the spanking essay and this, they're all obviously part of your psychic framework. But anyway, go ahead, Daphne. I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was just going to say that what was important to me, I think, to relay was that I don't believe this kind of predilection simply goes away, since the predilection involves, for better or worse, you could say subjectively, a lot of passion. And I think along with Freud, I think passion by its being gets domesticated during marriage. I'm not sure passion is, that level of passion is meant to last, unless it continues in this now you have it, now you don't way forever. And I think you're right in the sense, I didn't want to make the end of the book, here she is happily acclimatized to normal, quote, normal life. I don't know if it succeeded, didn't want to suggest that her relationship with her husband was completely devoid of sexual pleasure.
Right.
I don't know.
That comes through. No, I think that comes through, that it's not by any means a disastrous marriage or even a blank marriage. Yeah.
No. But I do think that the whole notion of sexual passion might be a misunderstood concept. I mean, I assume there are many ways of having a very passionate relationship. One of them could be much more romantic than hers, although it's hard to put together, I think, which Stoller talks about, that he knows very few couples where love and passion go together. That's one of his points.
It's one of his key points, that sex and hostility, that he thinks that lust and hostility are joined at the hip. It's a very, controversial and very powerful notion.
It's a notion that I know from people I've talked to that's very resisted because of the, quote, normative paradigm that psychoanalysis constructs. Although if you look at the private lives of many psychoanalysts, it doesn't hold up. Unfortunately, I know many of the private lives. Love and work, the kind of, and Freud's own life, because I'm researching a novel about Martha Freud. Not a novel, sorry, a biography of Martha Freud. And he famously, in a letter to, I think, William Fleiss, wrote that he had stopped having sex in his 40s. I mean, I think Freud was one of the great sublimators of all time. I mean, all that sexual energy or libidinal energy went into his endless thinking and writing. But not sure where I was in all this. I don't think the kind of sexual life of intense excitement is available, really, unless I'm thinking of when I wrote the spanking piece, I got a lot, the most I've ever gotten for any piece, except a piece I wrote against fetishizing pets in the Times. That got the second most. there were a lot of people who belonged to it's called Eugenspiel Club in New York, where it's serious S&M. People go and hang themselves from chains.
Right.
And I met a woman from the club who wanted me to go with her, which I never did. And she was entirely covered with bruises. Now, that wasn't my idea of any form of sexual pleasure, but I think the whole thing is on a spectrum.
Exactly.
Really, what people consider. I mean, I was just thinking that today I always get the acronym wrong, BDSM, is that it?
Right. Yeah.
That there's been a move to sort of make it more play and performative. And I think there is a certain amount of power play in any relationship. But I don't know. I don't know if I think, someone asked me, did I think BDSM was therapeutic? And I said I didn't really think it was a therapeutic endeavor, unless you're very conscious that you're resolving this wound by being wounded.
Right.
But I don't know if that's the way most people go through it. I don't know if I went far off your question.
No, we're all just talking. And I don't know, Roxanne, if you want to bring in anybody yet. I could talk to Daphne ad infinitum about this stuff. Tell me if you want in the last 20 minutes to bring in any
so
of
David,
the visitors.
Probably everybody's like I am. I'm just riveted by the conversation, but I'll give everybody a reminder that if they would like to ask David or Daphne a question, to type it in the chat box. That will come to me. And then I will ask the question, and you're welcome to ask questions of David or Daphne. But I think absent that, David, I would have you and Daphne to continue the conversation for another 10 minutes, certainly. And no other questions come up. I can understand why, because you guys are doing this pretty perfectly. I'm having a very good time.
Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to talk to you about, Daphne, are the epigraphs of the book. There's one from Camille Claudel who says, "There was always something missing that torments me." That's approximate translation of the French. And then from Louise Bourgeois, who says, "I'm a searcher. I always was and still am searching for the missing piece." And I think too of that amazing essay of yours, which I think I included in an anthology that I co-edited, your beautiful essay on losing your scarf in the back of a taxi cab, and that you sort of divide people up into those who are obsessed with loss, which is to say death, and those who are oddly blithe about loss.
Right.
And I guess I wonder, I mean, I'm trying to play with those epigraphs in terms of your work in general. There is always something missing that torments me. I'm a searcher. I always was and still am searching for the missing piece. I guess the question I'm trying to get to is, do you think I mean, this is sort of a funny question. It might be a little confessional, but do you think you and I mean, this hour is not about me, it's about you, but I'll include myself as well. I mean, do you think like that you're weird or I'm weird or we're weird because we're interested in that missing piece and that's our particular brokenness? Or do you think everyone is broken and we just have the temerity to want to actually explore it and dramatize it? It's obviously not an either or question, but sometimes I think about, am I just more obsessed with loss and tormented by loss than most people? Or as a writer and as a Stoller acolyte, am I just more willing to be candid about it?
Right. No, that's something I think about a lot myself. I mean, I think, to be fair to both you and me, there is such a notion as artistic sensibility, which isn't just sensitivity.
Right.
And I think many, many writers of a certain caliber are very invested in the notion of loss. I forgot who said it. I think a French writer, Jules Renan, said all paradises are lost paradises.
It's actually Proust, isn't that? Is that a Proustian idea? But anyway, probably.
It's a Proustian idea, but I think.
Is it from Renan?
Yeah, I don't know for sure. I could be wrong.
We can check.
I think the ideas of loss, regret. I once wrote a piece in response to a book by Adam Phillips, in which I said, unlike Edith Piaf, I regret everything.
That's great. Yeah. What book of his was it? Monogamy or no?
No, it was called. I actually wrote a profile of him and thought for the Times, before they ever heard of him, they kept saying, but who's Adam Phillips? And thought I would never want to go to him as a therapist.
I agree with that.
Never. But he wrote a book about sort of accepting the life you live. I forgot what it was called. It was.
I think I've read that one. Yeah, it's very normative, isn't it?
Yes. And since all his books are written with slightly, well, this is a certain arrogant, epigrammatic style, they merge for me, some of them.
Right.
What he's saying in monogamy and what's he saying in the one called embarrassment.
Right.
One of the things I think he's saying is that nothing is as it seems, which isn't that profound a realization. But I think there are people who go through life and absorb loss and sort of put a line under it, you know, was what it was. It's the same thing with regret. It's too late to look back. Since I personally am enormously interested, you could say they're uncomfortable or even dark emotions like regret and loss. It interests me to write about them, to read about them in books by, for instance, you. And I mean, since loss eventually leads to the big loss of death, I don't see how one can simply circumvent it. But as you say, I don't think everyone, I think many people or a lot of people live in the everyday, in the moment. They're not casting around for what informs them all the time. But I think loss, as I said, there are only so many themes. I mean, Proust is about loss all over the place. And one of my favorite novels is Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, which is in its own way is strangely about loss, but not in a linear way. But also the bargains people strike. To get one thing, you have to lose another. There aren't perfect people or perfect solutions. And I think underlying them is a sense of loss. I mean, I don't think everyone runs across the city as I did, risking life and limb to retrieve a scarf.
Right. It's such a great essay.
You know,
yeah.
David and Daphne, one thing that I want to add to the part of the conversation that you're having now about both of you experiencing something that somehow is or isn't representative of others. It brings to mind, I had an interview earlier this week with a a gentleman by the name of Mark Brackett, who wrote a book called Permission to Feel. And what he would suggest, and he has a scientific, an evidence-based way of getting in touch with your emotions and identifying them and understanding them. I think that, Daphne, your point, and I'm basing this on what Mark said, is most people are feeling these emotions because they're human.
Right.
But they do not have the capacity to identify them, express them, understand them, regulate them. So they channel what you and David are giving a name to and identifying and exploring, and they don't have the equipment, the skill, the bravery to go there. But it's hard for me not to believe that those aren't human qualities, but you and David have the bravery
Yes,
and the
the
skill.
stupidity to explore.
No, but I think, and this goes very back to the very beginning of the conversation, where I forget which one of you said it, that when someone reads, Daphne said it, that if all you're doing is identifying for yourself, then that's just a slight part of the experience. But the companion to that, Daphne, is that they are potentially exploring a part of themselves that they have not given recognition to, or a name to, or believe exists in them. And that's another dimension to how people read. I don't know whose quote it is about the most intimate thing any of us can do is read, because we're having a conversation with our realist self.
Right.
So I think writers like both of you are giving, if not voice, exploration to a reader to think about themselves differently. I don't think it's merely voyeuristic.
Right. I agree.
Yeah.
But
that they're doing by reading either of your books.
Right. But Roxanne, I was just thinking of two things. Several agents ago, the agent said to me, when they say you're brave, they mean you're crazy.
That's true too, Daphne.
That's true too. I remember when my daughter was in high school at Brearley, there was some mother's lunch, which I tended not to go to. And this mother, very proper seeming, sat down next to me and actually said, I've read some of your pieces and I sometimes wonder, are you crazy? So she
Really? How'd you answer her?
said, yes, very. No, I don't know what I answered her. But the other thing that you said about people having these emotions and maybe not having access to them.
Right.
There's also the notion, a friend of mine who is a very good writer, whenever I tell him, mostly when I tell him of something that's happened in my life that I have a response to, he'll say, practice repression.
That's a good one.
He is a WASP, so it's easy to practice repression.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it's another way of dealing.
That's right. But what Mark Brackett would talk about is that there's a difference between repression and regulation. That repression will find its way into other outlets, drinking,
Right.
violence, depression, anxiety, whereas regulation is more about you understand what's going on, but you also understand when is the right time to act on it, express it, expect something from someone else. So it's a very different It's a very different way of thinking about managing the emotion.
Right. Sounds very different from repression.
Yeah, exactly. So we're a few minutes out from the close, and one thing I just want to mention before I forget, Daphne, in all the conversations we've had, I don't think we've ever talked about that one of my top 20 books is also Moviegoer.
Oh, yes, I find it remarkable and also very prescient. The whole
Yeah,
stuff about
I want to reread it. I haven't read it in probably 15. I've read it a couple times, but probably not in 15 years.
I checked it recently.
But David and Daphne, how about if you each have a closing comment or a closing question, or Daphne, a question you want to ask David? Why don't we end with another few minutes of conversation?
Sure.
Sure. I mean, I think that woman's question to Daphne is such a perfect place to end, or where she, there's so much aggression in her question. Are you crazy?
Right.
To me, what she's implicitly saying to me, maybe this is a very generous reading, to me, she's saying, you have totally named who I am in my secret self. And the only way I can hide from that is by offshoring that on to you.
Right.
Because why would she need, like, if she just thought that you were crazy, that she'd have not read the essay, she would have avoided you at the school function. But to say you're crazy is, to me, a classic psychological tell, because that she needed to tell you that she was more normative, and in that desire to show that she was more normative, she's actually confessing
Right.
how deeply crazy she is, several layers deep. I mean, that's just such a moving story to me, and that kind of gives the entire game away for me. But to me, that's what a lot of the work that you and I tend to like to try and do and read and write and teach is exactly that space that you might say rips off the bandage of, yes, everyone's just fine and normal here. Can we please access our sort of shared craziness? Because the only way to get sane is to try to be honest about some of that, deep psychic woundedness.
No, I agree. I think an unlikely writer, Somerset Maugham, said there's no such thing as normal, which I always thought, for Somerset Maugham, who I thought of as sort of superficial, but I think a better writer. But David, I have one question for you, because it's something that comes up a lot with me and must come up a lot with you. People always say to me, do you think people know you very well because of what you write? And I always say, no, I don't feel known particularly by what I write, no matter how personal and, quote, confessional, a word I don't love, it is. Because even with the most, for me, even with the most personal, call it confessional writing, there is a distance of the writer, of the crafting it, which I sometimes think is underrated. Like, people who don't write think they can sit down and say, I was bored today, and then I saw Lucinda and we had coffee. That kind of like automatic relaying of your life, which is what confessional writing is. But do you feel known by your readers, would you say?
It's a good question. We'll have to have a second seminar on that one. I mean, I think it sounds like we're almost out of time, but I think it's a great question. I would land on your side of the equation for sure, Daphne, in that I think what you and I want to emphasize is how completely curated that self is, that when you're performing an essayistic gesture, either Unlikely Obsession or the Scarf essay, or even Enchantment with its autobiographical novel feel of Romana Clay, or whatever the book is, even the current book, it's a performance. It's a highly curated self. And I think, there is this sense that, I have said all sorts of things in quasi-public forum that perhaps most people haven't said about themselves. But I would insist that it's, in my case, and obviously your case as well, it's married to a thematic investigation. I tend to hugely exaggerate and theatricalize who I am, whether I pretend to be more obsessed with remoteness or racial issues or sexual obsession or reality or whatever the question is. It's a highly curated,
Right.
highly dramatized self. And I think that's the point that you're emphasizing. And, I know it's certainly a funny question as one goes through one's life, that people know more data about sort of you and me, so they think they know our souls, and would that were so. But I think your move is really crucial to emphasize that we're not doing lunch with Lucinda, that we're doing something really different in which we are using ourselves as a symbolic, to me, a sort of allegorical theme carrier to explore larger human questions, I hope.
Right.
Well, in 30 years of book selling, I've had the good fortune of engaging or witnessing conversations with authors in the thousands, literally in the thousands. And every once in a while, there's a conversation that feels like a enormous gift to those of us that are readers or booksellers. And David and Daphne, I would put this conversation in that category. I am very grateful, David, to you for the kind of knowledge and sensitivity and intelligence that you brought to the conversation. And, Daphne's been a friend for a long time, so I love almost every word she utters. But I do think that this conversation, which will, we post these and other people will be able to access it later on, and I'll mention it, is deserving of so many people to listen to. So I just want to thank both of you for joining us. I want to remind everybody that these are writers with published books, and we're booksellers. So a good move would be to buy these books. You can buy any one of David's 22 books. I would recommend, in particular, his book, Reality Hungers, Daphne's reissued novel, Enchantment, which has won some awards. I recommend you buy that. I recommend you buy Moviegoer. And of course, since this is why you're here, please buy 22 Minutes of Unconditional Love. And thanks to all of you that joined us. And David and Daphne, again, many, many thanks for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
Having us.
Sure. My pleasure.
Mine too.